Hello, you're listening to On Israel in Al Monitor. I'm Ben Caspit from Tel Aviv. Representatives of world powers and Iran convening in Vienna are busy looking for a formula to square the circle and allow the US and Iran to return to negotiations and even to the nuclear agreement that the US abandoned in the Trump era, until now without any success. Meanwhile, Israel continues to warn, to threaten, and to maneuver within the tremendous tensions between the diplomatic approach and the military option in the face of what Prime Minister Naftali Bennett calls Iran's nuclear blackmail of world powers. Hopes that Israel in the post-Netanyahu era would not clash in public with its closest ally on the Iran issue, and that all the disagreements between the sides would be ironed out behind closed doors, are being dashed one after another. Things aren't as bad as they were between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Barack Obama at the time, but nothing good is likely to come out of this current situation. Is Israel reading the map correctly? Does Israel know how to analyze Iran's thinking, forecast its moves, and enter into Iran's shoes for the sake of simulation war games? The answers to these questions are complex. From an intelligence point of view, Israel is the biggest and most important repository of Iran-related intelligence in the world. It has been updating its allies for years on developments between Tehran and Fordow, Qom, and Iraq, not the other way around. The question is whether its intelligence is sufficient in order to understand the Iranian narrative, foresee its moves, and analyze various scenarios. Our guest today is one of the most popular and credible Israeli analysts on Iran. Following 2 decades of service in military intelligence, Dr. Raz Zimmt has become the authority on the Iran arena in general and its nuclear program in particular. Zimmt holds a PhD in the history of the Middle East from the Tel Aviv University. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies and one of the most knowledgeable and fascinating voices in Israel's attempts to understand Iran. Dr. Zimmt joins us right after this short break.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber and Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspit. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts along with first-class reporting and analysis.
Now I'm privileged to say hello and welcome here to Al Monitor on Israel. Dr. Raz Zimmt. How are you doing, Raz? Shalom. Thank you for joining us.
Shalom, I'm doing great, thank you.
Let's dive into business, like we say. And my first question is that we all remember the widespread Israeli support when President Trump announced that he was pulling the US out of the deal with Iran. Looking back now in retrospect, can one concede that Trump's decision was a disaster, that instead of improving the situation, it only served to make it worse?
Well, I will certainly say that it was a strategic mistake, and I will also say that it was a predictable mistake. Because at the end of the day, if you want to assess the success or failure of this or any other strategy, all you have to do is to look at one question, whether the political objectives of this strategy were met. Now, I remember when I tried to convince my colleagues in Israel that this was a flawed strategy 2 years ago, people were saying, yes, but look at the economic crisis in Iran, inflation and unemployment and economic decline. And then I had to remind them that the economic issue was just the means, not the objective. I mean, if you'd ask President Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu, where do you want to see Iran in a number of years? They would certainly say, we want to change Iran's policy. That was at the very least. Some would perhaps say that we would like a regime change in Iran. And then if you look today, yes, the economic situation in Iran is very bad, and we can discuss it later. But certainly the political goals were not met. Iran did not change its policy, or I would say it did change its policy, but on the wrong direction. It actually started perhaps doing nothing after Trump decided to leave the deal. And if you'd asked me the same question back in 2019, perhaps I would say, I would give you a different answer. But as soon as Iran, back in May 2019, exactly a year after Trump's decision to leave the deal, adopted the so-called maximum resistance strategy, it was very clear that Iran was not going to be forced into more concessions, but just to make more progress in its nuclear program.
You know, when I talk to our people here that supported, most of them, this what we just called strategic mistake, they say, listen, Trump did not have enough time. It happened too late in his presidency, so he needed 3, 4, or 5 years in order, to establish one of the 3 results that we thought will happen. If we are talking about the maximum pressure strategy, you just mentioned the maximum, the Iranian side. So I think our side hoped that either the regime will collapse, or the Iranians will crawl back to a better deal, or Trump will launch an attack, a military strike on the infrastructure of the Iranian nuclear program. Nothing of these 3 options happened. And I wanted to ask you, maybe it was because they didn't have enough time. This is I think the formal reason that they give me.
Look, if it was just for, if there was only one problem with the maximum pressure strategy, which was that President Trump was not reelected, and if it was the only false assumption on which the strategy was based, I would say, well, perhaps they were right. But in my view, there were at least 3 other false and unrealistic assumptions of President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. The second one was Trump's readiness to use military force. And already back in 2019, I remind you that since the summer of 2019, Iran carried out several attacks on oil crafts in the Persian Gulf, and then the American UAV, and of course, then in September, the big unprecedented attack by the Revolutionary Guards in Saudi Arabia. And the only reaction coming from Washington was tweets used by President Trump. But I would like to address 2 other very severe and unrealistic assumptions. One is that economic pressure would force Iran into more concessions. Now, I'm from the beginning assessed that was not going to happen, not because Iran is not vulnerable to pressure, but first of all, because my view was that the Iranian regime, the Iranian leadership, considered Trump's decision to leave the deal as the ultimate proof that all the United States wants is a regime change in Iran, because the perception of Iran, and especially of Khamenei, the supreme leader, for years has been that the United States should not be trusted, and that the nuclear issue is just the pretext, just an excuse for the United States to put more pressure on Iran. So Khamenei kept saying again and again, even if we agree to stop all our nuclear activities and give up our nuclear program, that would make no change, because the problem the United States has with Iran is not with nuclear Iran, but with an Islamic Iran. And when Trump decided to leave the JCPOA, it was considered and presented by Khamenei as the ultimate proof that he was right all along. Now, the Iranians have always considered the nuclear option as, I would say, an insurance for the stability of the regime. Now, if you consider your nuclear program as an insurance for the stability of the regime, no matter how pressure you're facing, you will never give it up. The second problem was that when you put economic pressure on Iran, you tend to disregard the fact that in the past Iran managed to deal with sanctions. I remember Foreign Minister Zarif saying that the only real advantage Iran has, or one of the advantages, is that Iran holds a PhD in circumventing the sanctions. So they know how to deal with sanctions. The other flawed or unrealistic assumption was that even if Iran is not ready to make more concessions, then the economic problems will become so extreme that the Iranian people will go to the streets, and then we will see a regime change, which of course was a flawed assumption, because we know how the Iranian regime knows how to deal with protests in Iran, and we know that economic pressure does not result necessarily in a regime change, especially in a country like Iran.
You know, I remember since the days of Ephraim Halevi as the Mossad chief in Israel, I think something like 20 years ago, they promised us every time that the regime is going to fall down, the Ayatollahs will not hold, it's a matter of time, and time passes and nothing happens, and I want us to speak a little about it, but first let's go to square one. Can you get into Iran's head? How they are making their decisions? Let's start with the obvious question. Are they determined to reach military nuclear capability? Or is the famous alleged fatwa issued at the time by Khomeini banning a nuclear bomb still relevant, or is it fake?
Look, if we want to understand Iran's nuclear strategy, I think we have to go back to the second half of the 1980s when they made a decision to renew their nuclear program, which stopped actually after the Islamic Revolution, because the Khomeini and the Islamic regime considered the nuclear program of the Shah as another example of this wasteful, unnecessarily plans of the Shah. But then one of the lessons, I would say the main lessons learned by Iran following the Iran-Iraq war, was that Iran has to develop major deterrence against its enemies, because as you all remember, Iran was facing Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi ruler, who was even ready to use chemical weapons against Iran, and Iran had no response. It had nothing to do. So one of the lessons learned by that is that Iran has to renew its nuclear program. Now, and it doesn't matter who the enemy will be. So my sense is that Iran still wants to become a nuclear threshold state and not necessarily have obtained nuclear weapon. Over the years, I would say Iran understood that there is a very big difference between the way the international community and mainly the United States are treating countries which has nuclear capabilities, such as North Korea, and countries which don't, like Iraq. And I remember after Muammar Gaddafi was toppled by the opposition, there were discussions in Iran saying if only Muammar Gaddafi would have kept his nuclear capabilities, yes, nobody would do anything against Muammar Gaddafi. So I think that my sense is that Iran has not made a decision yet to break out for a nuclear weapon. And when they hear the assessments given by Israeli and US officials, including intelligence officials, saying that Iran is still 2 years away from nuclear weapon, my conclusion is that no such a decision was made. Iran wants to reach the threshold position, and that the only thing which will separate it from obtaining nuclear weapons is one, political decision to be made by the supreme leader, and second is not a very considerable time, something between weeks or a few months.
Okay, now can you tell me how is Iran dealing with the situation these days? On the one hand, their economy is in free fall and public unrest seems to be growing. On the other hand, the Americans are signaling weakness, and the other powers aren't really interested in a clash with Iran. So is Iran simply trying to get the best deal possible in negotiations, or had it decided to exhaust the West and tread water? Maybe we should say heavy water all the way to a nuclear bomb.
Well, I think this is the main question right now as as the Vienna talks have resumed. It's very difficult for me to say whether Iran has made a decision to go back to the JCPOA and all it wants is to obtain more leverage to get more concessions from the other side, or that it has made a decision not to go back to the JCPOA and all it wants is to waste more time. I would say that Khamenei and the Iranian regime have good reasons to go back to the JCPOA, but it also has very good reason not to go back to the JCPOA. Because on the one hand, you can certainly say that Iran is facing a very, very bad economic situation. Let me emphasize, Iran is not on the verge of economic collapse. There has been even some positive developments over the last 2 years. For example, increase in oil exports from Iran, mainly to China. We've seen a very slight economic growth this year, at least according to the predictions of both the World Bank and the IMF. But still there is inflation of around 45%, a very big budget deficit, and even the economic growth is not sustainable. In addition, as you said, there is growing protests going on in Iran. But on the other hand, the assessment, I would say, of the Islamic regime right now is that even though there is economic crisis, they can certainly survive it through what they call the resistance economy or resilient economy, through the assistance of China. They also assess that they can certainly deal successfully with the growing protests going on in Iran. So I would say that it's very difficult to say what at the end of the day Khamenei would rather have, whether he wants to go back to the JCPOA, remove most of the economic problems or at least some of the problems and get relatively stability, which is very important in Iran right now because we are approaching the post-Khamenei era, or that he prefers the status quo, surviving economically, but reaching the threshold nuclear position. If I were Khamenei, I would definitely choose the first option. I would like more stability in the present times, but we have to remember Khamenei is old. He thinks more and more about his legacy. He certainly doesn't trust the Americans, and I would say that the bottom line is that I believe Iran wants to go back to a deal, but only in its own terms.
Okay, so now we reached what we say in Hebrew, the elephant in the room, the very delicate and worrying question of the so-called military option. It's not only Israel's, it should be even the US military option, but let's start trying to understand it. It's not secret. The only time Iran suspended its weapons-related activities was in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq and Iran feared it might be the next in line. Is the use of force the only language Iran understands? Is Israel's demand that the US present a concrete military option against Iran something that could get Tehran moving in the right direction, or is this an illusion? And if this will not happen, I think the chances that it will happen are very, very slim. How does Iran view the threats emerging from Israel? The talk about reviving the Israeli military option and prospects of an Israeli strike in its territory. Is Iran taking these threats seriously, or is it discounting them?
Well, first, I wouldn't say that the use of force is the only language Iran understands, because let me remind you that back in 2013 to 2015, Iran agreed to renegotiate and even roll back some of its nuclear progress it made due to other reasons: economic pressure, the US position that it was for the first time ready to accept and recognize Iran's right to enrich uranium, the change in the Iranian administration. Ahmadinejad was gone, Rouhani was elected. The second thing is that we have to remember that there is a great difference between what happened in 2003 and today. Back in 2003, I think Iran really believed and really assessed that there was a very big possibility that the US is going to use military force against Iran, just as it used military force against Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, it's a totally different story. Today, Iran is in position to believe that the US is moving away from the Middle East, and that there is a difference perhaps between Israel and the United States. Israel perhaps is more ready to use military force, but perhaps it can't do that. And the United States is capable of doing that, but doesn't want to do that. So I don't think that that only threats and talks and even military exercises will be enough to convince the Iranians that they might face an immediate military option. When it comes to Israel, I would have to say that I can't think that Iran is not taking into consideration this possibility. But at the end of the day, they know how to read the Israeli media. They know that when Israeli officials speak about the need to refresh operational programs, to buy certain types of ammunition, to be engaged in more exercises, that means that Israel right now is in no position to use military force. It might take months, it might take years for that. And the second thing is that I think that Iran is still in a position that Israel will be it will be very difficult for Israel to use military option unless it receives at least a green light from the United States to use that. And of course, it's very obvious that the United States doesn't want such a military option to be used, mainly because of the implications that might have on US forces in the region and the possibility of regional escalation.
Yes, and we just have in Israel a few publications that claim that the United States asked Israel right now not to act in Iran, not intelligence or covert or commando or whatever, not to interfere with the efforts to renew the negotiation or to go back to the agreement. But finally, I want to ask you about the Iranian public, the Iranian people, because you follow them so closely in the last 1 or 2 decades. To what extent is the Iranian public on the same page as the regime? And I'm not talking only about getting to be nuclear. I think more interesting is to talk about the Islamic Revolution. You know, there is, I am sure you saw there was a famous video on the channels on YouTube and everywhere when they showed an airplane, a passenger airplane flying from Tehran to London. And as when they came into the British airspace, within 1 or 2 minutes, all the passengers changed their outfits and they came in the airplane as you know, Islamic radicals and the conservative, and they came out of the airplane like foreigners. I'm sorry, like Westerners, totally, the women put makeup and took off the burqas, etc. So we think that the Iranian public is not there anymore in the famous Islamic revolution as it was presented by Khomeini, but maybe I'm wrong.
Look, I follow the social developments in Iran very closely for the last 2 decades. I will say this. First of all, it's very difficult to speak about the Iranian public. There are 85 million Iranians. Some of them support the regime, some of them are against the regime. Whenever I'm asked, do you think that Iran is on the verge of a revolution? I usually say, I don't think so. But if tomorrow morning I will hear in the news that there was a revolution in Iran, I will be able to explain very good why it happened. Because yes, you are right. There is certainly a growing gap between the Iranian public, the Iranian population, mainly the young generation or some of the young generation, and the Iranian regime. Not just because of the failures of the regime to provide and to address the grievances of the population and the economic crisis in Iran and other cultural and social and demographic trends, but because many of the Iranians are indeed walking away from those revolutionary ideals of the late 1970s. Having said that, I think that while we should certainly not underestimate the power or the influence of the Iranian public opinion, we can certainly not underestimate the abilities and capabilities of the regime. And it's not just about the oppression. People usually think that it's only because of the oppression that the Iranian regime is able to continue living. It's not that. It's not just about that. First of all, there are still some groups within the Iranian society which support the regime, or whether because of ideological reason or because they are dependent on it. If I were an Iranian teacher and I have to work for the government, and I'm dependent on the government for my salary, for the health insurance, I would think twice before I go to the streets and protest against the regime. And then you have the weaknesses of the protests in Iran. Yes, there are many protests in Iran, but still they are sporadic. They are mainly about economic issues rather than about political change. We still don't see this kind of coalition between sectors as we saw in the late 1970s. And perhaps I will say last thing, which is many Iranians, when you ask many Iranians, why don't you go to the streets by millions? Or because even in November 2019, during the big protest in Iran, there were not more than I would say 300,000 or 400,000 Iranians in the streets. And when you ask many Iranians, why don't you go more to the streets? Some of them would tell you because the alternative might be worse. We had our revolution 43 years ago, it failed. And when we look around at the Arab world, what happened in Syria, what happened in Egypt, what happened in Libya, we do not like the regime in Iran. We would love to wake up tomorrow morning and see different regime, but we might get a civil war, we might get the Revolutionary Guards taking control of the government. We don't want that. So I think that the bottom line is that if someone, and I personally would like to see a regime change in Iran, but you can't base your strategy on having a regime change in Iran anywhere soon.
And when it will happen, and I allow myself to add, it will happen like whatever happened to the Soviet Union. It will be very, very sudden. But I think ultimately it will happen, but no one knows when. Dr. Raz Zimmt, it was fascinating and very interesting. I thank you again for joining us here in Al Monitor. We'll take now a short break and come back after it with some final thoughts. Toda, thank you very much, Raz.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Gilles Kepel, professor at Sciences Po and Normal Sup in Paris, and author of a number of books and articles on the Middle East. Through my new podcast, Reading the Middle East, on the award-winning media service and Monitor, we will take a deep dive into the trends in the region with the authors and thought leaders who are shaping how we think about the Middle East. Reading the Middle East will be a fantastic addition to Al Monitor's outstanding podcast lineup, including On the Middle East with Andrew Paraziliti and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspit. You can subscribe on your favorite listening platforms. We look forward to your joining our conversation.
Thank you for staying with us. I think one of the most important points in this very interesting conversation with Dr. Raz Zimmt was when I asked him what is the main reason that makes Iran so determined to get nuclear weapons. And he said that it's actually its need to get major deterrence against its enemies. He said that the seeds were planted during the Iran-Iraq war when the Iraqis used chemical weapons of mass destruction, and the Iranians didn't have any answer. And the regime understood that without being a superpower of unconventional weapons, they will not be stable. Another thing that he said, that he's not sure that the final decision was already made to get the bomb. Maybe, said Dr. Zimmt, that the leaders in Iran, he meant, of course, Ayatollah Khamenei, are going now to be a threshold state, a nuclear threshold state, and then to place Iran in a situation, not necessarily a nuclear state, but a situation that within one more decision, there will be only weeks or maybe a few months between this decision and obtaining nuclear weapons. This is maybe, in Dr. Raz Zimmt's opinion, the ideal point that right now the Ayatollahs are going to. Another good example he gave us is the fate of the late dictator Muammar Gaddafi from Libya. The Iranians saw how the international community, NATO, and all the other players treated Gaddafi, that did not get nuclear weapons, although he had a nuclear program, but he agreed to get rid of this program in order to get many benefits from the West. But then when he was fighting for his life, political and real life, he was not nuclear, and he was treated in a total different way than, for example, President Trump treated North Korea. And of course, Dr. Zimmt agrees to what most of the analysts in Israel are thinking, that making President Trump or convincing President Trump to get out of the agreement, the nuclear agreement with Iran, was a strategic mistake. In Iranian eyes, it was the ultimate proof that the United States of America is not after the nuclear program, but after the regime. They want a regime change. And by the way, he said, Dr. Zimmt, that Iran, unlike what we all thought about the maximum pressure strategy, Iran, even today, suffering so long from the sanctions, its economy is not on the verge of economic collapse. This is all bad news, but ultimately he agreed one day the regime will be changed, but no one knows when it will happen. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope to find you here next week on the same time, in the same place. I'm Ben Caspit from Tel Aviv. Take care. Bye-bye.